My name is Andy Lappin from Glen Cove, Illinois. And here we go. Okay, some Bears fans. And I am a proud investor for many years in FDD. The question that our next panel will address is, are we still fighting a war on terrorism? 14 years after that 9/11 attack, there are more terrorist regimes and organizations controlling more territory than ever before. What does this mean for the security of America and its allies? Less than 2 years ago, a common refrain in Washington was that al-Qaeda was defeated, or was on the path to defeat, or was on its heels, or had been decimated. Among the reasons that I invest in FDD is that its scholars recognized that this conclusion was based on flawed analysis. FDD challenged that analysis, where many failed to do so, and helped many policymakers, lawmakers, and much of the public understand what was actually taking place. One important medium for communicating with the foreign policy, military, and intelligence communities is FDD's The Long War Journal. This online publication combines granular information, all of it open source, with cutting-edge analysis regarding such issues as the development of al-Qaeda affiliates, the rivalries among al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and al-Qaeda's complicated relationship with Iran. Our next panel will delve into these related issues. We look forward to hearing from David Gartenstein-Ross, Mary Beth Long, Matthew Olsen, and Fran Townsend. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists, and let me now turn it over to former Deputy National Security Advisor and FDD Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance Senior Counselor, Juan Zarate. Thank you.
Andy, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. How's everyone doing? What a remarkable forum. Thank you, Cliff, to you, to Mark, the entire FDD team, Andy, for your support, and those who've supported FDD over the years. Thank you for all of your work and support. This is a great forum. I know I'm honored, and our panelists are honored to be here today to talk about an incredibly important issue, not just to FDD, but to the country. Are we still waging a war on terrorism? And just to echo Andy's remarks, I remember just a few years ago after the death of bin Laden, being in debates in fora like this, where people were arguing that the end of terrorism was near, that the counterterrorism experts, like many of us up here, were going to go the way of Sovietologists, and that there was no longer a need to calibrate our national security policy around the evolving terrorist threats, that it was in some ways on the decline. But as we all know, the threats appear more diverse, perhaps even more dangerous today than ever before. And I can't imagine a better panel to discuss these issues, both in terms of the terrorist trends we're seeing and the policy implications, than the folks we have up here. And I've been honored to work with all of them in various capacities, to work for them in some cases, and really this is an expert panel. I won't go through their bios. You have them in the forum agenda and background. But what I will say quickly is you have deep expertise both from within government and outside of government. And so let me just begin, because we have a short period of time to get into a lot of issues. And Matt, let me start with you. You are sort of the last serving in government. You left as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. How do you see the landscape now, and what makes it different and perhaps more dangerous from your perspective?
Sure. Thanks, Juan, and it's great to be here. And it's fun for me to be a little bit unshackled from my time in government, be able to speak to a group like this, not from the point of view of being inside the government, but being on the outside now. I mean, I think in a word, it's complexity. that the threat has become so much more complex over the last several years. If we were having this discussion just a few years ago, we would have been very focused on core al-Qaeda, in Pakistan and our efforts against core al-Qaeda. Now we're talking about really a number of ways in which the threat has changed. First, just in terms of the groups, we're not just obviously focused on core al-Qaeda, the affiliates, AQAP, preeminent among them, of course, ISIS, Boko Haram. So there's proliferation of groups. And then, as Andy mentioned at the beginning, it's the geographic expansion of the threat. So it's not just hunkered down in the AFPAC region, but it spreads from South Asia across the Middle East, again, particularly in Yemen, but then all the way across North Africa. And then beyond just the geographic expansion, it's complicated in terms of tactics. So one of the ways in which the threat has changed is the types of tactics that they now employ, and really explicitly saying, let's try to carry out less sophisticated attacks. Wherever you are, if you believe in this ideology, carry out an attack, kill an American, strike a military target or a police officer. And obviously we've seen that with some of the recent attacks in Europe, certainly in Paris, and we've even seen it in some ways in the United States. And across all of this, I think this complexity is the problem that we've seen of foreign fighters going to Syria, and the way that has changed really the complexion of what the challenge is for counterterrorism experts now inside the government.
Fran Townsend was assistant to the president and Homeland Security advisor, has had more than 2 decades of career in counterterrorism. I first met Fran at the Department of Justice, and Fran actually brought me to the White House. I think maybe a mistake, Fran, on your part. But in any event, Fran, from your perspective, given some of the complexities that Matt's laid out, how do you see things playing out? And importantly, do you think we're still at war with terrorism? And what does that even mean to you?
Well, let's be clear. The terrorists believe they're at war with us. Now, that's only half the answer, right? We certainly have not acted like we're at war with them. And what do I mean by that? Special forces often talk about find, fix, finish. We're good at the find. We're good at the fix. We are horribly deficient at the finish. We will announce the victory of the war when really only what we have is a victory in a set-piece battle. This is what Matt's talking about. We killed bin Laden. That's one set piece. It was an important set piece for which the administration gets tremendous credit, having had 2 administrations work that target. But whether it's Libya and we take our eye off the ball and we don't finish it and it devolves into chaos, or Yemen, the examples are legion. One of the things Matt refers to in terms of the complexity, so I'll give you one example, Juan. We've seen ISIS develop a propaganda capability unrivaled that al-Qaeda could only have dreamed of. Just yesterday, ISIS released a rap video in German calling for attacks against Western targets, including in New York City, where I live. And they disseminate it using our own strength against us, right? Social media platforms that have been developed here in the United States, Twitter, Man-Bar-Me, you name it, and they use that to disseminate. They can recruit, they can raise money. It is a very sophisticated enemy that no longer do they hide in the shadows. Al-Qaeda's idea was to hide in the shadows, move about, and make it difficult for us to find them. These guys actually brag about their accomplishments and issue propaganda and beheading videos out publicly.
Yeah. And I do want to come back to the social media dimension, because I know, Fran, you focused on this, and it's a key part of the evolution of these groups. Mary Beth, I want to take from what Fran was saying in terms of whether or not we're at war still and how we view the landscape. In part, we're very reactive, of course. We also have a strategy now that very much relies on partner capacity to be able to contain the threat and to protect the homeland. That strategy looks like it's collapsing in places like Libya and Yemen, difficult in places like Somalia, Iraq, and in some cases non-existent like Syria. And so how do you think, especially given your role as a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, where much of your work was working with foreign counterparts on building their capacity, on aligning interests, how do you see this playing out? Because we can't be at all places at all time, but at the same time, we can't be wholly reliant on others to protect against the evolution of this terrorist threat.
Well, I think it's a particularly difficult time for partners, in part because this so-called war needs partners. We're going to have to execute and strengthen our partners, but from a partnership perspective, there are 3 elements that are missing. And that is, what is your strategy and your policy for executing the war? We've been really unable to articulate that, and some would argue that we've been a bit inconsistent. In a strategy for war, one does not unilaterally take assets off the table or declare deadlines to war. So that's the kind of mixed messaging or incorrect messaging that an ally says, this is not a strategy, I'm not sure what I'm signing up to. The second thing is an ally looks to see what assets and tools are you making available, not only to prosecute this war, but in order to protect me as your ally, as your partner in this, should something happen to me. And there again, we've been very inconsistent. We haven't been willing or able to put everything on the table. We've been incredibly inconsistent, even in our own execution of kinetic tools, to take some soft power tools off the table. We draw red lines and then we back off. So it's very confusing for an ally or a partner to sign up to. And then the third thing is an ally or partner wants to know that you're committed to him and you have credibility. And there, frankly, we're incredibly lacking. We have not been credible. We have not articulated a policy. And in fact, probably with our potential partnership in the global war on terrorism or war on terrorism, our credibility is, in my estimation, probably at a several decades long all-time low. So then you look at your partnership pool and you say, well, what pool am I going to derive from? Some of the partners, of course, would complain that what was the strategy in Libya we were not sticking with. I think it's obvious to many of us that there are Arab partners that we are going to need in order to prosecute this conflict with terrorism. And for them, this is an ideological war, and they're a little unsure of why it's not an ideological war for us, but I don't want to put this aside. So the basic answer is we need to, first of all, come up and articulate a strategy. We need to have credibility in articulating that strategy with our partners, and then we've got to enable our partners, and we've not done this. There's a lot of overlap with our interests with Saudi Arabia, with the Gulf countries, with the GCC, with several of the Central Asian countries. We have not reached out to them. You can't reach out to them if your president or your senior executives are unwilling to meet with them. They're more interested in meeting with former enemies like the Venezuelans and the Cubans. You can't really have a partner who hasn't understood what you're trying to do and who will team with you. So from a partnership perspective, while we talk about it a lot, I think we're in dire straits and we're not on the path to really building capability. And there's going to be gaps as we pull out of Europe and as we diminish our presence in many of these places. And we have not done the groundwork to make sure that there's a willing, true partner able to help us out there.
And I do think there are some examples of where that partnership has worked. For example, in Southeast Asia, where that's worked
Correct.
better than in other regions. The problem, I think, with this administration is they're not willing to champion that kind of a model because it wasn't built here. It came from the Bush administration in many ways. But that's me with my partisan hat on. Forgive me. David, let me turn to you and ask this question because you've done a ton of work over the years in scholarship on the evolution of terrorist groups, their ideology. And I want to ask you 2 questions. One is, why have you seen this acceleration of the ISIS or Daesh brand, where all these affiliates around the world are beginning to be drawn to the idea of the caliphate and fly the banner of ISIS in their work, in Libya, in Central Asia, even in Southeast Asia? Why is that happening? And secondly, and related, how do you think about the competition between al-Qaeda and ISIS? Is it really a zero-sum game?
That's a great set of questions. The competition between al-Qaeda and ISIS is a very interesting one. And I'd go back to what Fran said about al-Qaeda being the terrorist group that's in the shadows. That's precisely what they were and what they are. A number of al-Qaeda leaders, including bin Laden, were chess players. And it's very much a chess player's strategy. It's extraordinarily complex with multiple front groups, unacknowledged affiliates, and we can see this very clearly. The Nusra Front in Syria, it took a long time for them to acknowledge that they were al-Qaeda, even though the writing was on the wall. A couple of groups that recently, due to this competition, announced that they were al-Qaeda are Uqba ibn Nafi in Tunisia and the Caucasus Emirate. Until then, a lot of Western analysts swore that they were not part of the al-Qaeda network. I think that Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia continues to be an unacknowledged al-Qaeda affiliate. It's very complex. Now, the reason why the Islamic State was so effective at the outset is because al-Qaeda had a strategy that was a very good strategy for a two-player game, where it was them against the United States / non-Muslim powers. But when you interject a third player into the game that's coming at it from al-Qaeda's side, they can take al-Qaeda's strengths and turn them into weaknesses. So the fact that you have all these unacknowledged affiliates, that's actually a strength in a two-player game because it allows them to do what they've done in Syria. In Syria, it's really hard for the US to attack al-Qaeda because of the US's strategy, because al-Qaeda is so deeply embedded throughout the entirety of the Syrian opposition. It makes it so that the US can't really attack them without angering the entirety of the Syrian opposition. That's a good strategy. Now, what ISIS has done is they've taken al-Qaeda's deceptions literally and said, okay, you guys are nowhere. You guys are weak. And they came with this communications apparatus that's far, far better than al-Qaeda's because al-Qaeda was trying in being in the shadows. It wasn't flouting itself, whereas ISIS is the noisy player. They come in, al-Qaeda says they're nowhere. ISIS says, yes, you're nowhere, and we're everywhere. They also give disaffected members of al-Qaeda an opportunity to have this other structure that they can be a part of. So they're very noisy. Often they've actually used outright deception to advance themselves. In Africa, for example, they do in fact have a Libyan network that is nothing to sneeze at, but they've also gotten the media, including CNN, including BBC, to report that they control an entire city, Derna. If you Google Derna, you will still see reports, like as of today, that ISIS is in control of Derna. They are not, and they never have been. But they were able to convince people of this based upon showing video of a parade through Derna streets, an ISIS flag on a government building. All of this goes to their loud strategy, which isn't above using outright deception to make themselves appear stronger, and in order to get al-Qaeda affiliates to either defect, as you've had in the case of Boko Haram and also Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis in Egypt, or else to have people leave the groups and join ISIS. Now, in terms of the overall state of the competition, what I'll say is I wouldn't at this point, even though al-Qaeda's strategy is not a great strategy for this three-player game, I wouldn't count it out because you have this other factor, two factors going on simultaneously. One is that ISIS has moved the window for what we consider unacceptable for a jihadist group. And you definitely within the region have a reconsideration. Well, look at ISIS. Maybe al-Qaeda wasn't so bad after all. And the second thing you have is basically a Sunni-Shia sectarian conflict. And you can see it in Syria and you can see it in Yemen, which means the Gulf Arab states are again looking for partners. Now, the partner's not going to be al-Qaeda itself, but you can see, for example, in al-Muqalla in Yemen, which al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula captured. Then they left, and this group showed up called the Sons of Hadramaut, named after the province that it's in. It's almost certainly al-Qaeda, but I would put money on the Gulf states' willingness to support this Sunni ally, given the broader context. So I think what we're seeing on al-Qaeda's side is while everyone's saying ISIS, 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 they're using the opportunity, and look, they're going to have to adjust their strategy, but at the same time, they're using the opportunity to get back the state sponsorship that we thought we beat a decade and a half ago.
It's a great point, David. And Fran, I want to come to you in part because you have such deep expertise working so closely with the Saudis and with the Gulf countries, and take the point that David just made about sort of the environment, the Sunni-Shia conflict, and how that begins to impact both the ideology and the support for some of these extremist movements and how that plays out. So how do you view that landscape complicating matters?
So, look, the Houthi were in Yemen on Saudi Arabia's southern border there at the time of the Bush administration. And we were talking both to the Saudis and to then the Saleh government in Yemen about our concern about that. The Houthi is a tribe. It's supported it's supported at least financially by the Iranian government. It is a threat to the Saudi regime, a Sunni regime. But remember, if you're the Saudis and you're sitting in the center of the Gulf, you feel like you're threatened by Iran to your south because of the Houthi, to your east in Bahrain, to your, you've got them in Iraq because of the influence in Iraq, to your north. And so you feel the pressure of this conflict. You've had a long historical relationship built by people like Mary Beth Long and others with the Saudi military, many of whom have trained here. And suddenly, when you have said you've offered your military support and assistance to fight an Iranian-backed Assad regime in Syria, and the American government draws a red line and walks away, and you are then directly threatened in Yemen, and you put together a military plan, and your American ally says, good luck, we'll give you some intelligence support, let us know how that goes. I mean, this is a situation in Yemen which the president himself has held up as a counterterrorism success. So you can imagine they feel like they are in this existential Sunni-Shia battle. You can name the partners, the various factions on the Sunni and Shia sides, but for them this is an existential threat. And we haven't even mentioned yet the impact of this Sunni-Shia battle on our only democratic ally in the region, which is Israel. I will tell you, if there's any good news to come out of this panel, which you might be surprised.
The doomsday panel.
Right. So here's one bright spot. It is now well and pretty public, the alliance policy-wise between Israel and the our Gulf Arab allies on the common view of the threat from Iran. And that has been, that's actually an important strength in this, if we could articulate the strategy going forward.
Mary Beth, maybe turn to you, and then Matt, I want to ask you a couple of questions related to what Fran said. But in terms of this partnership abroad, given all the work that you've done in the past, what are the constraints? I mean, we are under some real constraints, both from a resource perspective in the U.S., and then, as you articulated, from a legitimacy perspective, or even a believability perspective. Where do we go from here? If we are in agreement that we have to contain the threat, if not defeat it globally, how do we do that given the current environment and given the limitations that we've discussed?
There are a lot of things in the current environment that we can change. Iran's hegemonic aspirations, the fact that some kind of nuclear arrangement has moved from the proposition that should Iran have a nuclear weapons capability to when Iran can have a nuclear weapons capability. Fran is exactly right. There's an almost open, and in some places actually open, discussion in the potentially strategic partnership of the Gulf allies with the Israelis, that neither of them can live with this. Interestingly, the Gulf and the Arabs have looked very carefully about how we've treated Israel and the very difficult and the tension with our relationship there, and have raised an eyebrow as to what that means as far as our objectives. But I think there are things that we can change. There are places where, frankly, we've been our own worst enemy, and there are initiatives that we can take that can make this situation better. And that at its core is leadership. We have not been a leadership on this issue. We've led from behind, which doesn't make sense for anybody who's actually looked at it. We've gotten in our own way by trying to exit from the region. The fact of the matter is, in foreign policy in general, but in that region in particular, if you're not present and you're not strong, you're not there. And if you're not there, you're not credible. So we have to be there. We have to have a policy articulated. We have to be clear about what the guidelines are, and we have to live by them. And that's a political decision. That's not a resource decision. It's not a religious or other decision. That's simply a political decision that we have not made. And then we've got to make a strategy. We need to articulate it, and we need to have consensus and discussion with our allies as to where they can play and fit within this strategy. Compromises will be made. I've had more individuals tell me in the Arab world lately that we didn't particularly agree with many of the decisions of George Bush and others, but we at least knew what their decisions were. Now America is in this area where we have no idea what your path is, what your strategy is, and what your goal is. So it's impossible for us to say where we fit within that. So that's something that we can remedy ourselves. We can provide them with defensive weaponry and get out of our own way on export and some of the fears that we have regarding some of the technology that is proliferating and available on the world from China, Russia, France, and Britain, yet we act as though our potential allies and partners don't have alternatives to things that we want to sell them and that they want to buy from us because most of them want long-term military alliances with our country. Those are three very simple things that we could do tomorrow if we decided we were going to, and we haven't made those decisions, and I would hope that we will before it's too late.
Matt, I want to pivot to you on two fronts. One, the question of how this terrorist threat implicates the homeland directly, because of course in your role you had to watch both inside the country and outside and how those related. But importantly, to Fran's point and to what Mary Beth was just saying, how have we crafted our strategy to think about the threat? Because one of the challenges that I've seen is that we have very much cabined the notion of what the threat to the homeland is and sort of eschewed the notion that developments and problems abroad are really U.S. problems. We've sort of said the Yemeni problem is the Yemeni problem, and some of these other problems just need to be handled. How do we deal with that reality that in a globalized environment, the local is global and the global is local?
Right. So it's a really important way to think about the problem, I think, Juan, in that, obviously, from my last job as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, our primary focus, our overriding focus was on preventing another 9/11, right? To prevent another attack of that level, of that catastrophic nature inside the United States. And, I think to some degree, with a lot of resources put into this, there should be some acknowledgement that there's been success on that front, right? Since 2001 through two administrations, a lot of effort's gone into preventing such an attack, and that's been a success. At the same time, there's a recognition that these smaller scale attacks are really, and I think this is something that we recognize inside the government, that this is a risk management problem in terms of small scale attacks. You just can't stop a single individual or two individuals. You can't stop every Boston bombing. And that's something that's very hard to acknowledge, because our goal obviously is 100% effectiveness, but it's not realistic over the long run. But to your question, much of that has been the effort to focus on inside the United States and to really be precise when we talk about the threat. So talking about al-Qaeda in this very general way is actually not that helpful, because it's not sufficiently precise. We need to talk about which groups we're talking about, what those groups' aims are, and to what degree they actually pose a threat to the United States, both at home and to our interests abroad. And each of these groups really are different in what their goals are. And you're right that we look at the threat overseas differently. One of the reasons we do is that our levers are fewer. We have fewer ways to get to the second part of your question. What do we do about this? There's a lot we can do inside the United States. Obviously, our ability to harden our defenses it really is quite great inside the United States, but our options overseas are not. And part of that is the lack of capability of those we look to help us. The one thing I would point to that sort of covers all of this, and which is a concern of mine, is our intelligence capabilities, which are diminished. What I saw when I was leaving government last fall is that we had less capacity to target terrorists overseas because of the ways that they had changed their communications in light of the stolen NSA documents. And this is and remains a real problem, and it affects our ability to prosecute this conflict both overseas and inside the U.S.
Thank you, Matt. David, I want to ask you a question about the ideology, especially on the Sunni violent extremist side. There is this undercurrent, and there's a challenge between ISIS and al-Qaeda. There is kind of a baseline ideology that drives these movements. Can you talk to me about what the evolution of that ideology looks like and how that impacts things like social media, and also selection of targets like the Charlie Hebdo attacks, et cetera, where the ideology in many ways is imbued in the environment, and you have singular actors able to engage in strategic attacks that have much deeper impact than you would ordinarily assume?
That's a great question. Really, the ideological differences between al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are extraordinarily slight. They exist, but they're very small. Both of them are dedicated to reestablishment of the caliphate. Both of them are dedicated to imposing a very hardline version of Islam upon local populations and ultimately global populations. They differ in terms of whether they think that the prerequisites for establishing the caliphate have been satisfied. On the one hand, al-Qaeda argues that they haven't been, that the caliphate, such as it is going to simply get wiped out by its opponents, which is almost certainly correct. Whereas the Islamic State, on the other hand, argues that al-Qaeda is frozen, that there's a 5-stage plan for reestablishment of the caliphate, and they argue that al-Qaeda has remained frozen for more than 15 years on the very first phase. There are some differences in terms of interpretation of what permissible targets are. For example, after a couple of aid workers, Alan Henning and Abdulrahman Kasig, got killed by the Islamic State, some al-Qaeda clerics attacked the Islamic State for doing so, arguing that those aid workers were under a specific covenant. But overall, let's not be fooled about the ideological differences. They're very small. Both of them are bad news, just in very different ways and with different strategies. I think bringing up Charlie Hebdo is a very good example of where you have this intersection of local with global. The Charlie Hebdo attack, of course, was claimed by two attackers who very explicitly claimed it in the name of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Then you had a follow-on attack, Ahmadi Koulibaly, who attacked both a policewoman and then carried out an attack at the kosher grocery. And he did his attacks in the name of the Islamic State, which shows that for them, this wasn't this deep-seated conflict between the two. It was kind of like rooting for different sports teams, as though one of them was a Yankees fan and the other was a Red Sox fan, but they were able to still collaborate to kill, say, the Steelers fans, which was a horrible analogy to use, but that's basically the way that they looked at it. And so the fact is that when you look at this ideology of jihadism, of Sunni jihadism, it's a growth period. And the spark of that growth has been the Arab Spring. The challenge looks far different today than it did in 2011. There's no question about that. And so regardless of which team is currently winning or how we look at them, we need to deal with the fact that not only is this a growth industry, jihadism, but also it's brought more societies to ruin over the course of the past few years than we thought would ever be the case. You have them playing a huge role in Libya, an enormous role in Yemen. Tunisia very much feels threatened. Northern Sinai right now is somewhat of a safe haven, not fully, but you have a lot of jihadist movement there. Mali, you have an insurgency that's returning. Obviously, Syria and Iraq. Like, the global situation does not look good in terms of this problem set. The trend line is in the wrong direction. And understanding the strength of this ideology and that it binds these organizations is a very important part of understanding the world in 2015.
Juan,
Go ahead, Fran.
I would add to what David said. I mean, just to give you a matter of perspective, right? Not only are we in a growth period, we have the single largest refugee crisis right now, created as a result of this conflict since the end of World War II. You have 4 million people. So you're not just at war today with terrorism. I promise you, unfortunately, my children, and our grandchildren are in for this fight. Because you have that's the recruiting pool for the next 2 generations, right? They've watched the West stand by. They've watched mothers and sisters and daughters raped. They've watched fathers executed. And they've watched the Western world stand by without the strategy that Mary Beth talks about. So you rest assured you're not only at war today, but you are at war for the next 20 years with this, for lack of a strategy.
Mary Beth?
One little thing, and for those of you who've not read former DIA Director Michael Flynn's pieces on this, I highly recommend them. But as we talk about this war, one of the things that you see very few people talking about is who exactly is the enemy. It is this ideology, and let's call it for what it is. It is violent, radical Islam. And people get very politically upset and very religiously sensitive about that. But you can't defeat this unless you name it for what it is. And we've been extremely reluctant to do so. And again, that's a political decision. And if we don't make it, we're not going to get, and it is going to be a generational fight.
Okay, we're fantastic from the panel. We're going to move to question and answer. Please raise your hand. We'll have microphones. We'll ask you to stand up, identify yourself, and ask a quick question. The more questions we can get, the better. Why don't we go with this gentleman in the middle here?
Thank you. Jim Rickers. I have a question for Fran Townsend. The war on terror, however you define it, isn't this really the reemergence after a hiatus of something that's been going on since the 7th century? And really, after World War I, there was some limitation on that. So it's coming back. It's really a Muslim-Christian war that's been going on for 1,600 years. And if that's the case, you say, well, what was ever successful? And the only success in that was really the hegemonic role of the British Empire and to some extent the U.S. Empire. So isn't empire a solution, and what are your views on that?
Well, this goes back to something David said about the unrealistic expectations of the Arab Spring, right? So yeah, there is a Muslim-Christian aspect to it. I think, don't underestimate, there is, I think more so, a Sunni-Shia. There's a struggle there's a conflict inside the Islamic world that they have to resolve. There's also a religious secular, right? So you've got this sort of three-dimensional chess game in which, when you talk about a hegemonic power being able to provide stability and leadership, we've decided to take a powder. We've just decided that we're going to pull inward. Doesn't mean the threat goes away, but I think it's to Mary Beth's point. This is the critical need for leadership in the world. That's not to say this is not our Arab allies' fight. It is, but they still need American leadership and the infrastructure that we provide to coordinate everybody's bringing something to the fight.
Over here.
I'm Ken Abramowitz. When you look out 10, 15, 20 years from today, and you think of a situation where all the 4 worldwide professional political Islam terror organizations have nuclear bombs, you have Iran, ISIS, let's say, Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia have nukes. Do you think that we might have a good chance of beating the World War II record of 65 million dead people?
Mary Beth, you want to take that one? Sounds like a Pentagon question to me.
Yeah, me too.
I'll speak to it in terms of the short term towards the long term. I think you have a really good shot, particularly if you cede the fact of a nuclear weapons capability to a Persian country, which will be viewed as Shia. You will have a proliferation. It's no one's secret. People have been talking about this for years. It's remarkable that really within the last year, suddenly it's become something that people debate openly. But you will have capabilities, rightfully so, within that region to defend and protect what they believe to be their way of life. The possibility of even an accident or troops or others making a miscalculation that will bring us all to the brink of conflict, that because we don't have solid relationships and because we don't have leadership and because we don't have a strategy, could very easily cascade into something that could be catastrophic, not only to the region, but to U.S. interests abroad as well as to the homeland, is very possible. I think many people will tell you that this is by far the most dangerous time that they're aware of since World War II. And unfortunately, the proliferation of not only nuclear, but other weapons of mass destruction to the very lowest denominator, the very lowest, is a significant development, as is the proliferation of technology, where either truth or fiction quickly becomes spread very quickly and is accepted by 17-year-olds on up. When you combine that with the youth bulge of that region, where you have unprecedented numbers of 20 and belows who within the next decade will become of fighting age and of decision-making age, yeah, I know this is doom and gloom, but if we don't get serious, I do believe we are on a path to make World War II look like not something that we'll be proud of.
Yeah. This is the most dangerous time in terms of WMD terrorism, I think we've seen.
Absolutely.
This lady back here in the back. Yes, right there. We can't hear.
We can't hear her.
Mike.
I'm Shala Sadeghi from Voice of America, Persian TV. Recently, Europe has removed Hezbollah from the list of terrorists. Yesterday at Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the clause about Iran's terrorism activity was removed from the forwarded the legislation that Senate approved. Simultaneously, President requested the Congress to remove Cuba from the list of terrorists. It seems that Iran's removal from the list of terrorism and activities might be in the pipeline. What do you think the nuclear deal with Iran would have an effect on Iran's behavior in regards to terrorism? Because they say they are not directly involved in terrorism, but there are so many proxies which are said that are operating under Iran's support.
Matt, let me turn to you because you had to worry about all terrorist threats, not just Sunni threats. So how do you view the Iranian sponsorship of terror?
Well, obviously, it's a huge concern. It's the number one state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and has a huge role in places like Syria and Yemen, which are our primary concerns as safe havens overseas. So, Iran is just a huge problem. I mean, I should say I don't necessarily associate myself with all the remarks up here about the lack of leadership and strategy overall. And I do think that as we look forward, we are looking at a very long conflict, but I do think that there are opportunities to diminish the threat to Americans and to our interests. And I think the nuclear deal is sort of outside of my realm of expertise, but I think there's opportunities to engage there that might actually hold out hope for a more safe future for the U.S.
Let me just say, I think it was a mistake, right? So one person's view. The notion that you could negotiate a nuclear deal and ignore the fact that this is the single largest state sponsor of terror, and that it holds in custody illegally an American journalist, a retired FBI agent. I mean, there's a group of Americans in custody. None of this was addressed. It was as though it didn't exist so they could focus on the nuclear deal. I think we've got to view any negotiation in that context. And I think it's dangerous to believe you can circumscribe your discussion with them.
I apologize for this. We only have time for one more question. Let's go right up here to the front. This gentleman's been waiting patiently since the start. We could go on for 3 hours here if given the opportunity. Cliff, can we do that? No.
My name is Khani Zulam. I'm with the American Kurdish Information Network here in Washington. Ambassador Hill was on C-SPAN yesterday, and he noted that the religious wars in Europe lasted 30 years and not 31 years. For the sake of argument, let's compare the parties to the religious wars in the modern Middle East to the Nazis and the Soviets. Senator Truman at one time said that we should support the losing side. Is President Obama doing that? In that existential war, some folks stood up for the Poles. Churchill, for example. I would compare the situation of the Poles to the Kurds. Why do you think the White House is not embracing the Kurds?
David, you want to take this one in the context of ISIS in Iraq?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one very important aspect of this is in Iraq, the Kurdish Peshmerga have been one of the most effective fighting forces against ISIS. And certainly one of the most effective fighting forces that isn't going to go out and brutalize Sunni populations after taking over territory. They haven't received weaponry that's been promised to them. We basically have left them out to dry. The U.S. has a very bad reputation in that regard, which crosses administrations of leaving its allies out to dry. That's a real problem. Look, the center of power is shifting from nation-state-centric to violent non-state actors being an enormous part of what we're going to have to contend with in this world. And sometimes it means fighting against violent non-state actors. Sometimes it means supporting them. The Sunni awakening, the Sahwa in Anbar province that got expanded throughout Iraq is a good example of the U.S. aligning with non-state actors. But credibility is important to this, and not just aligning with allies when it's convenient and then leaving them behind. So with respect to the Kurds, there are obvious geopolitical reasons that the U.S. has been hesitant to ally with them too heavily. One is the concerns of the Iraqi government, who doesn't want basically Kurdistan to become a fait accompli, as it already is. Second, the concerns of Turkey. Third, probably the Iran deal, right, where Iran has its own sets of concerns. But the fact is that the Kurdish region is the most successful democratic experiment of the past 20 years. I mean, really, it's the end of the first Gulf War that started Kurdistan's path towards becoming independent from Iraq. It's really flourishing. And at the end of the day, I think that there will be an independent Kurdistan within the next 25 years. I think that, de facto, I believe there already is, but I think it will be recognized internationally at some point. I think that there are legitimate geopolitical concerns that we have, but also I think we could be more aggressive in that regard, especially because if you arm the Peshmerga, that diminishes the Shia militias from coming in, because the Shia militias, I mean, they are extraordinarily brutal. And in Tikrit, let's be very, very clear. We served as their air force. I mean, if you look at what was being said in the messaging, there was a message that the U.S. is bombing Tikrit, and so the Shia militias are off to the side. Yeah, right. They stood to the side for a day, maybe two. Then they went in. And they haven't brutalized the population yet, but they're going to. They're going to. And we need to recognize that. We can't have our blinders on with respect to what's going on, because defeating ISIS isn't the defeat of jihadism. Defeating ISIS isn't the defeat of Sunni grievances in Iraq. And unless we look at that bigger picture, this is just going to be a Band-Aid where the wound requires amputation.
Mary Beth, final thought, we've got to close.
No, I was actually, I'm going to just point out that this is a perfect example of partners in the region where we have not stepped up, and we are shameful in our public commitments and our lack of having delivered. The fact that the Peshmerga and the Kurds have also offered refugee to the religious folk that were being pushed out and slaughtered. We have really done very poorly by both Kurdistan and Jordan. That if either falls, we were going to have a real different region to deal with. I apologize.
No. Well, there's no question we're in a more complicated, diverse, and perhaps dangerous environment. There's no better group, as you see, to talk about these issues. And as I said, we probably could be here for hours talking about all aspects of this. But join me in thanking the panelists for their insights.
That was a great comment.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Thank you.